Hello and welcome back. We're the Tough Cut Podcast. I'm Matthew.
I'm Alex.
What up? I'm Jake.
And this is part 2 of our Sequel Showdown series. So if you haven't listened to the first one, go back and check it out. Had some great discussions there.
This is a show where we make a themed bracket, pick some of our favorite movies, and put them head to head until only one remains, and the rest have been cut. Our first bracket, like Matt said, is Sequel Showdown. Jake, you want to talk about it?
So yeah, we were talking about themes going head to head, and we wanted to do something where we compare sequels, whatever a film is. It could be the spiritual successor, it could be like a full, like just it has a 2 in the name, ooh, sequel.
Anything that isn't the first in a series.
Okay, yeah, maybe. What if I'm the first in a series?
Nope.
No, you're right.
This is a no and with no improv on this podcast.
Only when it comes to me. Anytime Matthew hears anything I say, he's just going to be like, no.
So matchups for today, we've got Shrek 2 versus Evil Dead 2, Godfather Part 2 versus Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. Hey, just want to throw a heads up to maybe a little content warning for a couple of the movies in this show, particularly Evil Dead 2 contains some scenes of fairly graphic violence and gore. So if you're at all squeamish, beware for that when we get to it. And maybe if you don't like murder, there's some murder in
Shrek 2.
All of these movies, I think, actually.
All of these movies have a decent amount of violence.
But specifically, Godfather Part 2 has some instances of domestic violence, so be aware of that.
Alex, do you want to take it away with Shrek 2?
Yeah. I picked Shrek 2. It's a wonderful movie. Released in 2004, directed by Andrew Adamson, Kelly Asbury, and Conrad Vernon. This movie is the continuation of the first Shrek movie. Shrek and Fiona have gotten married. They finish their honeymoon. They get home, and then they have to go to far, far away where Fiona grew up, meet her parents, and get the royal blessing from the father. But things go awry when they discover she married an ogre.
Spoiler warning.
Yeah, we forgot that.
But guys, I'm so sorry. Spoiler warning.
Spoiler warning. Spoilers for all of these movies. If you haven't seen Shrek 2, please stop the podcast now and watch the full movie. It really is a great watch.
I fully thought you were going to tell our viewers, stop listening to this podcast. I don't want your viewership anymore.
Also,
yeah. So I'll get into why I picked Shrek 2 as one of my movies. It's very nostalgic for me. I have a very close place in my heart for this movie. And that's initially why I picked it. But going back and rewatching it, oh man, what a funny movie. I think it really lives up to its definition as a sequel. So I'm excited to get into it. So yeah, what did you guys think about Shrek 2, the movie?
Well, this like for me, like again, I owned the DVD, or I don't even know, it wasn't VHS at that point. I owned the DVD. Yeah. I remember. Well, I remember because like the extras like was something that was like very like the far
there was the little
idol.
Singing competition.
Exactly. With Simon Cowell for some reason, like dude, like, and it immediately brought me back. And so few films when you're a kid like immediately bring you back to that headspace. I think there are a handful, and that could be a theme for another day. But there's so few films where it's like I watched this, I immediately got transported back to pushing buttons on my like DVD, whatever, to vote for the wolf to try to win. You know what I mean? Like it's that maybe isn't the movie like ahead of time, but like yeah, it was fantastic. Also, this is just like one of the best films of like satire ever. It's just like wow, it's fantastic.
So
yeah, those are my initial like really things I noticed. Being transported, that's like a hell of a power.
Yeah. So jumping right in off the tail of that, I also have a fairly strong childhood connection to this movie. Probably not as strong as you two. Very fond memories, though. And I enjoyed watching it again. I'll say the thing that really stuck out to me was how like trimmed of fat this movie is in a lot of ways. The runtime is real snappy and like it gets right into the plot real quick, moves right through it. However, it like simultaneously is just so effective at introducing you to literally an entirely new place.
Yeah.
That feels so at home for the rest of the Shrek series. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I think some of the pop culture references have not stood the test of time as well, but we can get into that a little more a little later.
There's some issues.
Yeah, for sure.
And I guess I'll pick it up with from there.
Yeah.
Jumping right into Evil Dead 2. So, Evil Dead 2 was released in 1987, directed by the BMOC, the big man of camp, Sam Raimi. Essentially, it follows the Well, I guess a clarification. This is a legendary requel, which is a reboot sequel. They didn't own the rights to the first movie, so they had to reprise it in the first 6 minutes of Evil Dead 2. They're a fantastic 6 minutes, and they tell you all you need to know about the plot of the first one. It is a cult hit that follows our lead, Ash Williams, played by the legendary Chin himself, Bruce Campbell, as he tries to survive the night and dispel the threat of the Evil Deadites, which are, these demon zombie creatures. It's very unclear. They're sort of their own thing. They're highly sarcastic, incredibly funny to watch. And these Deadites have been unleashed upon the world through a book bound in human flesh, written in blood, very evil. Fantastic movie. There's truly not much else to the plot other than that.
It's so funny. I need to cut you off because I need to give the viewers a little insight. Matthew took 2 hours writing that synopsis in real time.
Not 2 hours, but it was like 15 minutes. The word choice had to be perfect. I've got to call out Bruce Campbell's chin. I've got to call it a requel. I've got to hit all these points that felt important.
Sure.
It was a perfect, like, we watch each other like on a separate, like, while we're recording this also, and like he performed that, and just kudos to you. It won't give you points in the bracket, but it will give you points in my friendship.
It truly is a shame that we're recording these as podcasts and not a visual medium, because Matt is so expressive and you can hear it a little bit in his voice, but to see his wonderful hands gesticulating, his smile curling, it truly is a sight to behold.
And right in line with that, jumping into why I chose Evil Dead 2, I think it is just such one absolutely fantastic movie. It is so funny, such a great blend of horror and comedy, but what it meant for like 80s horror, and not only that, but what it meant for the Evil Dead franchise. Like, this is what put like Sam Raimi on the map in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like how he exists tonally, what Army of Darkness looks like, what Ash vs. Evil Dead, the like campiness of the Spider-Man, the Raimi Spider-Man movies, like that all dates back to this one. And I think that if you're looking at how one movie, relates to its successors, I think there's nothing better to highlight than Evil Dead to Evil Dead 2.
Dude, I mean, Sam Raimi just in general is just like a wild, like, he did Spider-Man 2 also easily could have been on this list. A very great sequel.
Excellent movie. It was very much a contender.
Truly. What were your guys' opinions?
I'm happy to give my thought.
Go for it.
So as the vanilla boy, staying true to my name in more ways than one, I also am a terrible scaredy cat and generally cannot stand horror movies. But this one was very fun. It was a good ride. I think the campiness and the like joy that's in all of the horror scenes really was fun for me to watch. I had never seen it before, but I had somehow seen a lot of clips from this movie. So I actually recognized a lot of it, which surprised me because I had never heard the name before. So to, recognize parts of it was very fun for me.
I wonder how people because I do think this film exists in the zeitgeist more than like people think it does. But I wonder, like, yeah, they'll hear Evil Dead and think of it. Like, they probably just see Bruce Campbell or a bunch of like spooky things or spooky, silly like images. Like that dancing scene, like with his like pretend girlfriend. I love the first 6 minutes of this film. Holy shit. Like you were talking about just like getting into our comparison. Like,
sure. Yeah, we can hop right into it.
You were talking about how like Shrek 2 was snappy getting right into it, but like Evil Dead was also right into
very
it. Like all of a sudden he goes into the cabin. You're like, wait, what the fuck? Why? Like if you saw the first one, you're like, why is he here again? What's going on? But then they're like, blah, blah, and then she's dancing and like, it's fantastic. I literally wrote in my first like review of notes where I'm just like, whatever. I'm just like, God, this is so fun. And like, I think they both start so fun.
What both these movies do so well is that they have a lot of very strong sequences, right? Because you have that like dancing sequence that jumps into like she's attacking him, and then then it gets into the chainsaw and like all that stuff, which is so good. And Shrek 2 is the exact same.
Head in the vice clamp.
He just buried his girlfriend right away, no problem. 7 minutes in, yeah, cross. Like you can't make that shit up.
But the sequences in these movies, I think, are so, so good. Because, like, if you think about Shrek 2, even the opening, that, like, honeymoon montage that they have is so, so good. And what it does so well is it gives viewers in Shrek 2 the exact impression of what this movie is going to be, because every single one of those montages is referential in some way, is like a pop culture, is something. The one that sticks out to me the most is like the ring spiraling down onto Fiona's finger, and then it lights up to say "I love you" in the same way that it does in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I love these movies. I think they are such an interesting matchup.
Something I want to take right off the bat, because I think, we can get into themes, we can get into like comparisons of the actual filmmaking, etc. But something I think is really, really fascinating is the way both of these movies exist in their franchises. I think Evil Dead, playing its role in what it establishes tonally and thematically going into Army of Darkness and Ash vs. Evil Dead, is so instrumental. Like Army of Darkness is like a comedy with some horror elements, arguably maybe an action comedy even. It gets its roots in comedy and like how Bruce Campbell plays Ash from Evil Dead 2. In the same way, all future installments of the Shrek franchise.
The Shrek franchise.
The Shrek franchise take Far, Far Away, and that becomes like the key locale for all future installments in I am going to keep calling it the Shrek franchise, and I'm
rebrand.
And I think like that's a really interesting relationship that both of these movies play such an integral role to charting out what future installments in their series look like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of like bouncing off of that, like something that I thought was amazing. It's not just like where they exist in their series, but like the deconstruction of their own series in a way. Like these, like not even just deconstruction, because again, Shrek 2 is amazing satire, but like Evil Dead 2 is also just horror is a very underrated genre. And I think it can like, you can have roots in like comedy and have roots in action and it still be a horror film. But they both deconstructed and both like peeled away a bunch of like what it could have been, an easy direction they could have gone. And they both now exist in cult status, which is something I really thought was going to be like super interesting to talk about. We're like,
I don't know if I would go as far to call Shrek. Like, I think that got pretty heavily into the cultural zeitgeist.
It gets knocked because people, in the same way that people knock horror, people knock animation, and they say like, "Oh, that was a kid's movie." And so I think now people go back and they watch Shrek 2, and they're like, "Wait, this fucking slaps." I think what Shrek 2 does so well that really gets overlooked, especially in an animation sequel, is the jokes in Shrek 2 are not referential to Shrek. I think watching it again, I only noticed one time where a joke specifically was because, oh, they said this in the first Shrek. And the only time that I noticed it was in that like final sequence when they're storming the castle and they launch a cannonball into Mongo's chest and the gumball drops off. Gingy goes, "Not the gumdrop buttons." That was the only joke, I think, that referenced the first movie. And so like to have a sequel that's a comedy, like a kid's comedy, and not have it just repeat the jokes in the opposite way that like Home Alone does, right? Where Home Alone was the same movie, Shrek 2 is a completely different movie.
It innovates so completely on the formula of the original. Yeah.
It's really well done, which is so hard for a comedy to do. I truly love it.
Whereas Sam Raimi was just like, "Fuck you guys, I'm going to create the wackiest shit because you screwed me over." Like, the energies were so kind of different, but like a similar result, which I just think is fantastic.
I think it is my lighthearted relationship with Evil Dead 2 that made me think of like, I literally had the entire time watching that movie had like the biggest smile on my face and like laughed my ass off at it. I think it is a terrifically funny movie. There was somewhere this point was going and then I got distracted.
All right, you were about to talk about the Shrek franchise. You're about to
I totally get what you're saying. And this is coming from the guy who generally hates horror. Like the scene of the girlfriend's head clamped onto his hand and he's like shaking it around, like smashing it into things. Like that's such a fun, funny sequence. And then for that to then build into his own hand trying to kill him.
Physical comedy. Who could do that besides Bruce Campbell? That was just, wow.
It's incredible. He's so funny.
Kind of going back on a point, kind of like talking about cult status and stuff like that. And also, this may be a little meta, but like Shrek now kind of is the brunt of a lot of people's like jokes or whatever, or at least it used to be like this like meme format and stuff. And I think that's why also I think it exists in this like kind of cult status where it's like when people hear Shrek, they don't just think of these movies anymore. They think of everything else like that has existed, like the Shrek is love, all the
Shrek is love, Shrek is life.
Yeah, like, and even more, like people really idolize this, and in kind of a similar way where like people like The Office is the best TV show, that kind of that. But for me, understanding that horror is made to like, invoke this involuntary response and like have this, like you can have fun. The genre isn't like not insulted, because I don't think Shrek 2, like the Shrek mythos insults it, but I think it's a more healthy trend of cult status.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Rather than being like taken by the internet and it's turned into like this weird outlet for fan content. It's the similar thing that happened to Sonic, I think happened to Shrek in some sense of like you just like start making fan animations in weird ways, like strange fan games, etc.
I think that's tough to say because that I don't think is on the movie. I think that's on the time that the movie existed in.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that's a critique necessarily, at least not on my end.
Yeah. I think something that I want to get into is characters, because they handle their characters in very different ways. Evil Dead 2, being like this horror cult classic, takes these characters and they're caricatures of like classic horror characters, right? And I think that's an interesting writing, like portrayal of these characters. But I think Shrek 2, the way that it handles its characters is very different. And maybe it's the fact that the movie has like a theme and a message.
Is that to say there's not like a message to
Does Evil Dead have a message?
Yeah, it's sometimes you have to dance like nobody's watching, I think.
I mean, I think that there's also like a major consistent theming of futility as like a huge piece of Evil Dead as a franchise. It echoes through the first one that all of Ash's friends end up, dead, turned into deadites, pursuing him, trying to kill him. He's the only one that survives, and it's very reluctantly so. That gets carried through into the second movie and amped up, that Ash becomes a hero that can literally save nobody. That it's an exercise in futility.
Okay.
I think that is like a huge piece of it.
Futility and fertility, because he looks good.
That partially is on me for not like being very familiar with the Evil Dead franchise.
Sure.
And it's also, I think, just discrediting horror in general. Like, I think, it's easier for it to be like, oh, I know the theme of this animated movie, rather than like, oh, I can pick a theme from this stupid, like literally wearing it on its sleeve camp horror film. But that's just something a lot of people fall into as a trap.
Well, but I think in some sense, horror movies are all about futility because it's running away from a monster that never stops coming after you, right? And that's most horror movies. Granted, I think the Evil Dead franchise, I guess Evil Dead 2, like specifically, like punches that. But I don't know. I think that is a fair criticism.
Sure.
I will say, giving Shrek 2 credit, like the way, just talking about characters, going back to that, like it just does so much to introduce characters that are mainstays and like introduce a world much better. Where like Evil Dead, like we're introduced, but we don't really like get rules. We're just kind of like, I don't give a shit about you kind of a deal, like for the viewers, but in a fun way. Where Shrek 2 like really like it introduces some really amazing and cool characters and does it pretty tastefully.
Yeah.
Something else I want to throw in about Shrek 2, very much, I think something you were working on getting at as we kept interrupting you, Alex, is that there is obviously this like background theme of self-acceptance that plays into all very prevalently in all of the Shrek movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Shrek 2 does in terms of taking that theme, amplifying it, and then continuing to find ways to recontextualize it into future entries, that thread finds itself dating back to how Shrek 2 handles it.
Right.
Which is just, I think really, really cool.
I think Shrek 2 does a really fascinating job of evolving the relationship between Shrek and Fiona, in that you see in the first one, it's them falling in love, learning like, hey, I can fall in love with this person. And in the second one, it's we've fallen in love. Now, what does that mean? What am I willing to do for our relationship? Right. And they're both willing to change everything. And I think it's done really beautifully and really tastefully. And then you also get these dynamics of like, what is family? What does it mean to be family with someone? With like Fiona and her dad wants the best for her, but he doesn't see that Shrek is the best for her. But then it's ironic that like he is like so against Shrek when he is the frog prince, which is like beautifully hinted throughout the movie. Like once you know that it's there, there's like tapestries of
it's like almost over the head.
But if you don't know it, you don't see it.
There's like lily pads everywhere. Yeah, no, and especially as a kid, like you're like, whoa. But
it's so well done. I also want to point out in Shrek 2, they take a huge risk. I don't know if either of you guys noticed it during the scene where Shrek.
Yeah. Full frontal Shrek. It's crazy.
You're closer than you think. When they're stealing the potion from the fairy godmother's factory and Puss in Boots is climbing up that tower of potions, you see Puss's butthole.
Wait, what?
It has a butthole cut. It's what cats want it to be.
It's not a cut. Like if you watch that scene, there's part where he leaps up onto the next shelf and it like is from below. The cat has a butthole, and I am not joking.
I am looking this up.
And that's a huge risk for a kids animated movie to take.
We're now going to spend the next hour talking about cats' buttholes.
Oh no. Yeah, don't Google Puss in Boots butthole. Oh God.
you
Matt, there definitely is not, discourse on this on the internet that you should look up.
Yeah, but now there will be.
If you look up the scene itself where they break into the factory, you'll see Puss's butthole.
Yeah, but make sure you put butthole in your search. Otherwise,
maybe if you're going to search, do incognito mode.
Cool. So I am temporarily scarred from the quick Google search that I just made. So I'm going to transition the conversation away from cat butthole. And I don't exactly know where I'm taking it to.
Let's talk about, what do you guys think is the most iconic scene from Evil Dead 2?
What I will say in terms of like favorite scenes or favorite sequences, one of the most significant is definitely Ash's fight with his hand.
Yeah.
I think it is just there are so many like little tiny incredible jokes, like the fact that when he's cut the hand off and he traps it, the first book put onto the stack is Farewell to Arms.
Yeah.
Is funny as that's so funny. It's so funny. Perfect. The fact that the scene in and of itself is a reference to a short film about the hamburger helper hand trying to kill people is also amazing. Like there are so many great aspects in that sequence, both in the sense of like you get some of these pieces of horror, your own body is trying to kill you. There's the body horror element of it like morphing grotesquely with practical effects, by the way. Very well done.
Very well done.
And then having to like rev the chainsaw with your teeth as you then saw off your own hand. That is so rad. Oh my God. As blood just sprays all over.
It's a fantastic scene.
And we're talking about Shrek 2, right?
And there's a reason that is one of the scenes. They technically reprise it in Army of Darkness, but they reshoot it to make it shorter.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Which is a little odd.
I love ridiculous.
The other scene I just want to throw out just because of like the cool factor of it, it's so fun, is the building of the chainsaw arm and the sawing off of the shotgun into the groovy at like, I think it's like 1 hour and 7 minutes into the movie. That is so iconic to Evil Dead. Yeah. Like that sets up like him and his boomstick. That is that is Ash Williams for the rest of forever after that moment. Like,
I don't know this, but if Bruce Campbell just said groovy or if it was like actual Sam Raimi wrote that, I really just want to believe that motherfucker went groovy and that's how he felt. Groovy. And like, that's fantastic. One of my also favorite scenes, it's not like super iconic, but like the dancing girlfriend. It's just it's so reminiscent of like House and like all that. And like, I just think it's so fun. It literally slays me every time.
I think something I want to jump into by contrast in talking about Shrek 2 is I think Shrek 2's ending sequence is one of the best ever. It's like such an amazing climax.
This is why I started the conversation, because what I think the sequences in Evil Dead 2 are really fantastic, but I think one of Shrek 2's greatest strengths is how it builds. Because Shrek 2 has a lot of really good sequences. Right off the bat, the montage of the honeymoon. There's them arriving in Far, Far Away. And that like beautiful dialogue moment of like bouncing back and forth is really smart. There's the dinner. There's them going through the factory. Then it all builds to, without a doubt, the best sequence in the movie. And it's so, so good. And I think for me, that's such points for Shrek 2 in terms of like the way that it builds. That final sequence for Shrek 2 is just so good.
Yeah.
Very much a chef's kiss. I think that something we need to talk about a little bit more, these movies as sequels.
As I was kind of talking about, like, I think they're just, as sequels, like, they both challenge different things in each other. Like with Shrek 2, you're clearly having more fun. You're leaning more into satire, like you're doing whatever. Like they're just having more fun here, and they're building a world.
Having more fun is subjective, because I think Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi had a great time.
So I'm not saying in comparison with Evil Dead. I'm saying like as it exists in their sequel. Like they're
compared to Shrek and Shrek 2.
Yeah. So like they're clearly having more fun than their original. They're expanding the world. I mean, obviously they want to make it a franchise. So they're expanding the world. They're like doing something. Right. And with Evil Dead, it's kind of similar. Like they lean towards, but like it's a very leaning into, because of Sam Raimi wanting to like just be like, all right, this is like the thing. And I think Evil Dead 2, as it exists, like as a sequel, is so interesting because, like you said, it's like a requel. Like it's like I'm doubling down on this. Like, okay, I can tell you kind of the deal, and I'm just going to get into the deal. And while Shrek 2 was like, okay, I'm really expanding the world, I'm doing whatever. Evil Dead 2 wasn't about expanding the world. It was pure fun. It was pure expanding the genre more.
It's so interesting the way that you talk about it, because like, yes, Shrek 2 was clearly setting up this stuff for a franchise, but the franchise after Shrek 2, I think pretty much everyone agrees, is much, much worse. And so that's, I think, part of why Shrek became a meme of like, oh, they're going to keep making Shrek movies. Whereas Evil Dead 2 was like very much the way you guys talk about this, like reimagining, like a requel of the first movie. And so it like Evil Dead 2 did, I feel like, so much more setting up the franchise than Shrek 2 does.
I think that Shrek 2, the way it expands its world in a lot of ways, is not so much to facilitate a franchise. Obviously it did, and I'm sure that was part of the intent, but I also think it is meant to facilitate like theming and story, more importantly. And that is where it dedicates such a huge amount of its energy. Whereas the requel element of Evil Dead 2, in my opinion, it's about the facilitation of story insofar as the story is to carry the tone of the movie. And that is the key element of Evil Dead as a sequel. Rebuilds the movie tonally, what this series is going to be about, and what this movie is going to be about is that campy horror, like comedy fun.
It just did so much for genre. Like it wasn't so much about like it's for genre. Like it did so much like establish.
It's not trying to facilitate just the story of that one individual movie. Yeah. Whereas I think a lot of what Shrek does in expanding is facilitating its own story. And I think that's I think that's huge points in different directions. I think it's huge points to Shrek. If you listen to episode 1, I talk about how a sequel expands the world in meaningful ways is really important to me in being an effective sequel. And I've got to say, there are maybe few movies that do that better than Shrek 2.
Yeah.
We'll get into it.
I'm so interested. I think we should vote.
I was going to say, I think it's time.
Yeah. So I guess we get into voting. Do we all have our votes ready?
I've locked mine in.
I'm ready. So Matt, you go first. What'd you vote for?
Maybe controversially, I am voting for Shrek 2.
What? Okay. Let's get into it. I also voted for Shrek 2. Jake, how about you?
I voted Evil Dead.
I think I was very much a little bit of a toss-up, but in a lot of ways, what it comes down to that element that we talked to at the end of what it does in terms of establishing world. I think establishing genre, I think establishing tone is super important, but I've got to keep myself philosophically consistent. I said what I think makes a good sequel already, baby. Got to stick to it. With that, I actually want to pick up and say that I may have just cast myself a death sentence by voting for Shrek 2, because on the other side of this bracket, I pitched Godfather Part 2.
Wow.
And Jake doesn't, I don't know. We'll get into it. I think he doesn't like this movie. I'm not sure. I have no idea. And I'm very afraid. However, Godfather Part 2 is Francis Ford Coppola's epic, released in 1974. It follows the parallel stories of father and son, that being Michael Corleone in 1958 as he's trying to manage his family's criminal empire as cracks begin to show in it, especially coming from his own family. Meanwhile, it runs the story of the father in 1917 as Vito immigrates to America upon the killing of his mother, father, and brother, and ends up in a life of crime, in some senses on circumstance, in some senses on opportunity. As far as why I picked this movie, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, what it comes down to is the first film establishes such a phenomenal emotional core with Vito and Michael. And this movie takes that relationship, despite, spoilers, Vito being dead, and manages to evolve on that relationship on so many themes the first movie establishes. I think in so many ways, this is a modern day epic. The scope is massive. I think these movies are so fantastic.
It's an opera.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a criminal opera. That is what this movie is.
So much so that it has an intermission.
It does have an intermission.
Yes, literally that is what this story is. I think it is fucking incredible. Full disclosure, I do like gangster movies, but I think this one sets itself apart in so many fantastic ways. Many of them, you know, like Goodfellas get so much praise. It is the story of Henry Hill. Like, it's a retelling of the story of a real person, of the book, of the novel Wise Guy. Sure, this is a novel adaptation as well, but it's a fictional story because it is meant to hit that grand scope. And I think it just does it so well. So your guys' impressions.
Yeah, I can give my thoughts. I had never really seen the Godfather movies before. And for this, in preparation, I watched the first one and the second one on back-to-back days. Not back-to-back, because I don't have 6 hours to spare on two
You don't
movies.
have 6 hours? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty good.
Oh God, I am done. I'm going to, my heart's on the line here.
I want to wait to get into my real discussion because most of my discussion is in comparison.
Sure.
I do want to thank Matthew for picking this, just because this is a film I've seen once prior before and I hadn't seen in a long time. And I think watching it in a new light definitely made me see it in a different light. With that being said, I'm going to introduce my film and then we'll get into the comparisons. I picked Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, 2014, directed by Matt Reeves. Just as a quick side note, this made me even more excited about the upcoming Batman. What a strange career Matt Reeves is having. It's pretty exciting. This is 10 years after the first one, 10 years after Rise. Simian flu wiped out much of the world's people. So Caesar by Andy Serkis, a fantastical mocap performance, and his ever-growing band of followers have established a colony just outside of San Francisco in the woods. But meanwhile, a small band of survivors emerges, which forces Caesar as leader to grapple with the dual challenges of protecting his people, but also reestablishing a relationship with the remaining human population, which is something Caesar secretly wants to do and is battling with. So that's that film. I chose it because I just feel as sequels goes, this is just one that is just such a clear improvement on the first and has it's very cinematic, bringing something back because, they're all prequels to what was the iconic Planet of the Apes franchise, not the awful Mark Wahlberg remake. Scratch that.
Tim Burton also, I believe, didn't he direct it?
Yeah, Tim Burton. Yeah, just let's.
That's so wild.
Make it stop. Just make it stop. Shoot it dead. Shoot it dead. Anyway, I just think being bold and doing such an iconic thing, and then also having it be a prequel, not just remaking the thing and trying to tell that kind of a pre-story of it. And it's just such a clear. To me, it feels like such a clear improvement of the world. I could talk a little bit more about it, but I'll throw it to you guys for kind of your thoughts on first impressions watching.
Yeah, I guess I'll go for it. I mean, I enjoyed this movie overall. I had seen it before. I think it was really interesting rewatching it in context for this show because I knew it was going to be up against The Godfather Part 2. I do think you see a lot of, probably speaking to your guys' similarities we're going to get to when we start comparing them. There are some interesting parallel themes, which I don't think anyone would expect with these two movies.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is pretty cool. Yeah, I think one of the interesting recontextualizations this movie has, similar to Shrek, that has been taken by the internet and memed, is that's happened with these movies for some reason as well. I don't know why on earth that happened, but I'm here for the ride, baby, and apes strong together.
I think it's way, way less than Shrek is.
Yeah, of course. I just think it's interesting that the meme culture has grabbed onto some of this movie.
Whenever James Franco just has his hands in anything, even though he's not directly in this one, it's just stuff happens. And
what I want to say about this movie, because I saw it when it first came out and was in theaters. I saw it.
Mm-hmm.
What hit me so hard this time, and I think it's because of our current historic, situation in the world with the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic storyline in this movie hits so much harder now than it did when I first saw it. Like, the first time I saw this movie, it totally blew past me. I didn't understand. I didn't get the significance. I didn't get really why they would be so afraid. And to fully understand, the one character Carver is so much more sympathetic in my second watch of this movie in such a weird, bizarre way. No, I think he's very sympathetic in his fear. His actions are pretty
also,
terrible.
my guy, a quick interjection on Carver. I feel like that dude is the type of guy to call COVID the China virus and say it was made by Chinese scientists. Don't get any more sympathy. I think I got more angry at him.
He's a Trump supporter.
But post-virus, he is the man. I
am living in COVID-19 right now, and I think of it. Yeah, I'm just saying. That's wild. That blows my mind. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt. I kind of
agree with Matthew on that, but I see where Alex is coming from, and I do have a point about it. But Alex, please finish your thought.
In my mind, he is a man who is so burned by the virus that he refuses to trust an ape, which, granted, pretty racist.
Yeah, a lot like a Republican refusing to trust Chinese people in this country because they believe the virus originated in a Chinese lab.
Yeah, just to bring it back to kind of the characters, but Carver is.
Sorry,
No, you're good. It's true. Carver is also Koba. Koba was too burned by the humans as the villain here, and just cannot trust a human.
Yeah, I'll let you finish. I that just blew my mind because I literally have it in my notes. These thoughts about Carver in new context because of COVID.
Well, it's so funny. This movie really does have a different context now than it used to. Both of these movies, I want to get into the comparison because that's where I think these movies both really shine. So Godfather Part 2 is the sequel, the passing the torch of his father's empire and simultaneously showing how he built what their family had, right? Versus Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is Caesar running his empire. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is Godfather Part 1. And I think it's so fascinating to look at the stories in the context of what they are compared to each other. I just think that's fascinating.
A strong part of Godfather is kind of analyzing that father-son kind of dynamic, but in a way where it's you're giving flashback. It literally is a prequel and a sequel in the same movie, which is fantastic. They do a great job weaving that story. But with Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, it's in real time. You don't get flashbacks, whatever, but you get the seeds of the apes are starting a civilization on the up, and the humans are kind of on the down, and that's how that's just how those generations and those kind of things are swapped. So there are similarities. I think Godfather benefits from those flashbacks and kind of interwoven story in that way from the first one. But yeah, I see what you mean, Alex.
A fun fact for anyone unaware is it was, I believe, as the script was being written for Godfather Part 2 prior to the release of the first one, is the working title was actually The Death of Michael Corleone. Vito's story is very much meant as supplementary to Michael's story, that you see that everything Vito does is being done for his family, as far as getting into crime, as far as trying to make it in America as an immigrant, which, a side note, I would never expect parallels between Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and Godfather in terms of identitarian politics.
Right. Yeah.
They have very different things to say on it, which is super fascinating.
Yeah.
They're both very political movies. They're both very fantastic. I forgot how heavy-handed some of the stuff Matt Reeves did with Planet of the Apes. That franchise in general. It's it's the sci-fi reflecting on.
Science fiction. Yeah. This is a close opinion of mine. I love science fiction. I read a lot of it. In so many ways, is literally the perfect avenue for political critique. There is such a rich history of political critique in science fiction. And I do think that is at the heart. I haven't seen the original Planet of the Apes movies in a very long time.
Oh, I thought you were going to say in general.
I do think that is a really pertinent element.
I think what Dawn of the Planet of the Apes does so well, which most post-apocalyptic movies fail at, is they make both sides truly valid. The humans in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes are just trying to rebuild. They're trying to like get any semblance of what they once had, versus the apes are building and are trying to keep what they've built, right? And I think most post-apocalyptic stories really, I think generally are like good versus evil, like this is the right type of society versus the wrong type of society. And I think I too love science fiction, and I know I tend to oversimplify, but I think that's just something that Dawn of the Planet of the Apes does really well.
Kind of going off that, and something I really wanted to like take note in. For me, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, like I feel like almost all characters, fuck Carver, I'm on the fuck Carver train, but all characters are legitimately, almost all are legitimately motivated or seemingly legitimately motivated, or at least they feel like they are in their world. They genuinely feel that way. Like also Gary Oldman, like props to his performance and stuff. Give him a megaphone.
So good.
He can do whatever. But I think comparing this to the Godfather's characters and a mafia movie, like a gangster movie on fighting is interesting because like, for us, like we want to watch sympathetic characters, or like, you know, when you have a protagonist, they have like there's some level of sympathy, empathy that we have to feel like when we're like watching them to a certain degree. Yeah. And I feel like when you're watching like a story about a killer and mobsters and whatever, we're still almost rooting for, like, we're still wanting the success of like the Godfather and his son and all stuff in that family in a way. But in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, like we can see again, like all the motivations, like we can see how they view each other as right. Whereas the Godfather is like, yeah, we kind of know that this is probably wrong, but we're rooting for it anyway.
I don't know that I agree with that. I don't
think I agree with it at all.
What both movies do really, really well is they show the kind of like delusional thinking that both Michael and Caesar have, where Caesar thinks that peace is possible if we just avoid conflict. Whereas Michael keeps saying, I'm going to get us out. I'm going to get us legitimate. We're going to be legitimate one day. And none of his actions lead towards that, right? All of Michael's actions tear down the legitimacy of his family and tear his family apart, ultimately. I think it's so interesting the way that these movies match up, because they're both about these delusional leaders trying their best and failing.
Yeah. And I think that in a lot of ways, this gets to Alex's earlier point. I don't think the parallels are quite as close to Dawn of the Planet of the Apes being Godfather Part 1, but I definitely understand where the comparison comes from. I think we get to see, we're not necessarily talking about War for the Planet of the Apes. However, that is where you start to see the death of an ideology, or the some of these other thematic elements you see in Godfather Part 2.
Mm-hmm. I also want to talk about in symmetry between the movies, like they both end. Well, so Dawn of the Planet of the Apes starts and ends on shots of Caesar's eyes, and they're very different. But Godfather Part 2 also ends on Michael's face and his eyes. Yeah. And I think it's such a fascinating thing. Caesar is, this is what I've tried to avoid. Look at what I've wrought. And this is what my people are resigned to. Whereas Michael is like a hardened resolution, versus Caesar is like a sad acceptance. And I think they're slightly different, but they mean very different things.
Yeah.
I think just talking ending sequences, something I want to highlight about The Godfather, just because I think it's particularly powerful, is you have that flashback, not quite to Vito's time, but taking place just before the first movie. And I think that, you are very much meant to get this feeling of this feeling of this realization that, oh my God, half the people in this shot are dead.
Yeah.
Sonny is dead. Fredo is dead.
He cleaned house.
His sister's husband is dead. Vito is dead. The Corleone family bodyguard is dead. I think that is really, really powerful. And that flashback is so much context for that final scene with Michael as he, sits quietly on a bench.
He was alone then. And even though he's accepted his family, he's alone now.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's so beautiful the way that it is written.
Just the third act in general of Godfather was pretty great. It's pretty phenomenal. It's a great third act. I do think it slows in some parts, but on that kind of note, to ease kind of Matthew and kind of reveal my hand a little bit.
I want to interject. Literally, when we pitched our movies and started forming this bracket, when I expected, because I love The Godfather Part 2, I'm aware that there's generally pretty good public reception about it as well. When I said it and Jake just kind of went oh yeah, I was like, oh my God, wait a minute. Does Jake hate this movie? a bit more context is Jake has a bone to pick with certain film makers who make a lot of these gangster movies. So I know there's additional mythos there.
No, I'll get to it. Okay, to ease your mind a little bit, and I'll build up. But I've literally been like making Matthew sweat this over and over and over.
Menacing vibrations.
Yeah. They don't really make films like this anymore. It's a specific feeling where, you know, they weren't afraid to linger in a moment and in surroundings and have this kind of background. Obviously, you have directors, as Matthew's hinting towards, like the awful Martin Scorsese. He's not actually awful. He's just a bitter hypocrite. And like, I love a lot of his movies, but like, come on, dude, don't be a hypocrite. But audiences shifted away from this kind of cinema, which is like super, super interesting. The reason why I've like felt that kind of way is I think it's a great sequel. I think the original's better.
That is so fascinating. Why?
It's hard because it feels more personal preference than anything. I think I like the emotion. I like the kind of buildup of the story without knowing some of the context, like I'm peeling back. And I feel like this film lingers in certain moments just a little bit too much, where I just feel like I don't really care about this. I know it gives context. I know it's supposed to, and typically I do love it. And again, I think it's a very good fit. Like I do like Godfather Part 2. I just prefer the first one more. And if we're doing a sequel showdown where we're talking about like the sequels are better, I just think the first one is better in setting up like just kind of just, I don't know, this life and this really interesting thing. I just feel like the second one is more supplementary, where it's like, oh, cool. This is cool that I know this.
I definitely get where you're coming from. I think for me, it comes down to when you have a movie that jumps around in time, where it, you know, goes back in time and like it shows parallel stories. I think that can be very powerful and it can be a really effective tool. I think when a movie is 3.5 hours long, it, in my mind, drags a little bit. And so I think I agree to a point where maybe it's also me liking current movies more than old movies. But for me, 3 hours is a long time. And I feel like
I don't mind that. I don't mind length of movies. That's like that's definitely not. I just think that their choices were just a little bit like.
I think for me, I'm explaining why I also like the first Godfather more than the second one. Not to say that I don't like the second one. I think I did like it. I do have to say, in terms of an important scoring criteria that I have are, how does my fiance feel about these movies? And Marina loves Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. And Marina hates The Godfather. She was bored to tears, and we had to stop watching the first one. I guess
there's not even a point for me to continue this conversation.
Truthfully, I still don't know which way I'm going to vote.
Actually, I want to say same.
I feel like it's going to turn into me like screaming into the void, and then just, you know.
Okay, my whole thing is that I think my whole thing about it is that if we're doing sequel like showdown, if we're comparing these two, I just think that Dawn of the Planet of the Apes as a sequel is much better. Like that's, and it's probably because I prefer the first Godfather like a little more or whatever. As a film, like as a whole film, maybe like The Godfather Part 2 is better, but as a sequel, I just think it just expands so much more for me.
So to speak to The Godfather Part 2 as a sequel, I think that there is such an incredible intertextual relationship between the two films, that you have the first film and the way it establishes the world you're going to be living in that sets up this, you know, criminal opera. You then have the second film. There are beats that are matched for the purposes of not just drawing parallels between Vito's story and Michael's story, but between Godfather Part 2 and Godfather Part 1. You know, you have the beginning opening on these celebrations in each one, with his sister's wedding in the first, with Michael's son's communion in the second. You have the midway point murders of Sollozzo and the NYPD chief in the first one, compared to Finucci's murder. Like, and you can take the ways each of these match up with each other and look at how all of them are either escalating themes that were seen in the first, and it's an intentional relationship. It is creating like a new circumstance around it. For example, looking at the meeting between the five families in the first movie, this is, you know, it's small peanuts. It's major crime families compared to the meeting scene in the second. They're shot in very parallel ways intentionally. which is corrupt industrialists, basically taking over a foreign country for all intents and purposes until Fidel shows up. That is a recontextualization of that meeting scene with like such a powerful escalation of what the underlying themes are. Michael saying at the end of Godfather 1 that, my father was in charge of people a lot like a senator or governor, calling back to his family's plans of him one day being a senator or governor, and then recontextualizing it in the second film with this meeting scene where he's literally like discussing with the head of a state. Like, there's so many examples of that. That is all built on that intertextual connection. That is all built on like what The Godfather 2 is, how it innovates on, and most importantly, how it expands the scope of the first movie in such a powerful way. And I get that Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is doing that because you get to see much more full-fledged context between societal clashes, which is a major theme that runs through the Planet of the Apes movies. But I just think it is so much more shallow than the richness you get from Godfather. And don't get me wrong, I think it's done well in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I just don't think it's done as well.
Do you think, and that makes sense. That makes complete sense to me. But do you think that like you may prefer like because with Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, it feels more like broad, like you can see like society versus society. But with Godfather, it's a little bit peeled back. Like it feels like it's broad, but it is just examining a family. And like that kind of like so it's smaller scale in that way where it's like, oh, I'm getting, it's almost like, this is almost like, I hesitate to say this, but like a slice of life film where it's like, this is a slice of life, like, you know what I mean?
A dark slice of life. That's a genre I would eat up. Send me recommendations.
But like, yeah, like I feel like this is way more specific.
I have to say, there's a conversation that we're shying away from that I think is very important to have. And it's the fact that, this is a point for The Godfather Part 2. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is afraid to show monkey penis. And Godfather Part 2 shows baby Fredo's penis right in that flashback scene. And I think that is an important note.
Just on the dick ratio.
You want to see baby penis. You're pro.
I don't want to, but it's the fact that Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, a movie that is so strong in its ideals, is scared to show monkey penis.
Yeah, but it shows so much feet. How much feet does Godfather Part 2 show?
Tarantino straight jacking off to this movie.
So much feet. And also,
I'm gonna tweet at him.
Are we ready?
I would want to maybe talk about like the villains and stuff, or like what we feel like is villain or like antagonist or like whatever. But I just thought that like with each of these, the villains are like just basically like almost everyone. Like there's clearly people who are viewed in like certain lights. But if you have people like Koba and Gary Oldman's character, which I don't remember his actual name, Dreyfus,
which is a fun reference.
That's a fun, that's cool. See, points to Don. No, so
Koba is such an interesting villain in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes because he represents what Caesar could have been in a lot of ways. Like he's the other, like he's another experimented on.
I think he's a great foil. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a really smart writing of a villain,
especially sequeled.
You clearly see at the beginning of the movie how grateful Koba is to Caesar and how much Koba loves Caesar. And then that turn partway through the movie when it stops becoming about what's right for the apes and it's about what's right for Koba, which they very plainly say.
Yeah.
But it's pretty well written. I think we haven't gotten into performances at all. Al Pacino is fantastic. Phenomenal. And in a very similar way, Andy Serkis breathes life into Dawn of the Planet of the Apes in such
and the mocap animators also.
Everyone should give acting nominations to the people who watched Andy Serkis in that suit and took him seriously acting across from him. Because watching him, it's a stupid movie.
I'm gonna have to look up those behind the scenes. They sound phenomenal.
They do literally like a cut screen where it's like you see Andy Serkis and like there, and Gary Oldman's just fucking acting it up, but like Andy Serkis is like huddled in the corner, like there, and he has like little teeth too. He put little like fangs in.
That's so
like,
he goes so hard, like the plastic vampire fangs.
Yes,
that's fantastic. Another thing about Planet of the Apes. The fact that the apes looked so real and so good and like still had so much raw emotion in their facial expressions. And comparing that to the recent Lion King, the quote unquote live action Lion King, it's so sad.
I want to add to that comment. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes came out in 2014. Lion King came out in 2019 and cost like $100 million more to make. And so much of it, I don't want to say looks like dog shit, because like it does have beautiful landscapes. It does have very talented animators, but the characters are so stiff, and you don't get that in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. You get incredibly expressive, what are, mocapped CG characters. And that is huge credit to the production team on Dawn of the Planet of the Apes.
We talked about the endings, like, with the shots of the close-ups of the eyes, like you got just as much emotion out of Caesar as you did from fucking Al Pacino as Corleone at the end. Like, what? That's awesome. That's fantastic.
With that, I do want to make one last comment to any of the decided voters, and maybe for you out in the audience. On one side, we've got Coppola's magnum opus in a lot of ways, this grand criminal opera. On the other side, we have the embodiment of the return to monkey meme. And what it comes down to, I'm not necessarily trying to win you over to The Godfather with that statement, but if you want to return to monkey, you think anarcho-primitivism is the correct form of governance, you know which way you've got to vote.
Do you care about the Ape cinematic universe? Do you care about Ape Genius? Do you care about the Ape?
The Ape featuring Dave Franco is in a lot of ways a prequel to Rise of the Planet of the Apes, where Dave Franco plays, I believe, a comedian who has like some kind of weird split personality thing. And there's a guy in a gorilla costume that is like his inner consciousness or something.
We went to college or whatever. He was political economy, philosophy or whatever. He wrote all these, thought pieces, whatever. He wrote an essay on that mentioned Ape Genius and the ape and like all this, like, come on. Like,
yeah, don't say I don't have any background academically in movies, you do.
So you should,
I've got creds.
You should know. I'm just kidding. The Ape cinematic universe, very tempting.
Okay, fair. Maybe you won me over with that. The ape. We didn't talk at all about the ape as a prequel and what that means for this movie. Unfortunate, and it's James Franco. Also, I said Dave Franco earlier. Right. I'm correcting myself. Want to give I guess praise. I'm gonna
write my answer. I'll go first.
Go for it, Jake.
I voted Dawn of the Planet of the Apes.
Matthew.
I voted Godfather Part 2, as you may expect.
So it all comes down to me. I voted for Godfather Part 2.
Took fat L's on today's episode, boys. Fat L's.
I'm sorry to say that, Jake. To me, it came down to the ways that it built upon the character. Godfather Part 1 is in itself an opera, a beautiful story. But what it really is the rise of Michael. And Godfather Part 2
is ultimately a better character study of what Michael becomes.
That's fair. It's honestly, this isn't a bad pick.
I think that Jake is pretty okay with it. He's like, yeah, not a bad pick. Meanwhile, I think I got so much more invested what I thought this conversation meant. My heart is beating so fast because I was so nervous. I have no idea why, because who wins doesn't really matter.
It matters.
That's how I felt about Shrek.
I took fat L's. None of my films have advanced.
Well, you only had 2.
None. I am out. And that's fine.
I guess with that, we've got some great movies advancing. Coming at you in part 3 of the Sequel Showdown, we've got Dark Knight versus Creed, which should be a really exciting matchup. And then advancing from this side of the bracket you just heard today, we've got Shrek 2 and The Godfather Part 2, which are 2 movies I'm not sure anybody has ever talked about in the same context. And I'll be careful. I hope Jake doesn't spite vote against me.
I'm not gonna
but I think that's an uphill battle.
No, genuinely, I think I'm content. I'm content. It'll be exciting. It'll be exciting doing the comparisons. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. I'm Alex.
I'm not Alex.
I'm Matthew.
Jake,
we
you made
are
that joke
the
last
Tough
time.
Cut Podcast. We are the Tough Cut Podcast. Follow us on all the socials at the Tough, not the, Jesus, I'm going to keep messing this up. Follow us on all the socials at Tough Cut Pod. That is Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd at Tough Cut Pod.
Yeah, and also, hey,
Yeah, tell us what you think. If you agree with our choices, if you disagree with our choices, if you had movies that should have been in this bracket that weren't, let us know.
Yeah,
if you want to return to Monkey, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to rate the show if you enjoyed, leave comments, refer it to your friends if you really liked it.
make me feel better. Make me feel better about my life from today's episode. That's your goal as an audience. I need reassurance that I'm not broken inside.
Thank you so much for listening. We're the Tough Cut. Find out next time what's going to make the cut. God, that was awful.